Now, it's very logical if you're a materialist to live for money. You don't have to, but it's very logical, right? Because reality, bottom line principle is matter. So live for money and live for expensive toys and gadgets.
Okay, if there was a God and that would mean that we are only not killing each other and acting in chaotic ways because we fear God and that we fear punishment or we desire, I guess, to go to heaven?
Sir, the reason I, as a follower of Christ, respect you is not because I am afraid of God. It's not because I'm afraid I might go to hell. It has nothing to do with it. The reason I respect you is because you're worthy of respect. You have innate value. You're not just an accident. You're a human being created by God for a purpose. God loves you, and when I look into your face, I'm looking into the face of a person who God loves so deeply that he sent his only son, Christ, to bleed and die on a cross for you. That's how much he treasures you. And if I demean you, if I'm disrespectful to you, that is absolute denial of your intrinsic innate value. It's a denial of reality.
Okay. I would have to say that people are deserving of respect because they are your equals, because we are all accidents in the same exact way. We don't have any purpose instilled into us. We just all are by accident, and therefore, since we are all from the same accident, and we desire to continue our peaceful society, that is where our morality stems from.
Okay. Now, my point to you is, do you think you can really live out what you just said? Because if what you just said is true, when that young lady looks you in the face and says, I love you, what you understand is, she doesn't have the foggiest idea what she's talking about, because life is meaningless. So she's just spewing out some words, and it's all meaningless.
It's not meaningless. She still has those feelings and those interactions going on in her body. She's telling me what her feelings are inside. It's not us having a purpose doesn't mean that she can't still have emotions.
Yeah, but those emotions are meaningless. They're totally random. And what she really means is you're hot, and therefore I, quote, love you. And when you say to her, I love you, what you really mean is you're hot. So let's see if we can couple. And that's all there is to really reality. And it's all meaningless, but you can have sex, you can copulate, but it's ultimately meaningless. And that's all life is.
Well,
and that's the despair of atheism.
Well, without God, it doesn't mean that love is for some reason based only on physical attraction. And also, I mean, everything is in essence meaningless. I mean, there's no real purpose unless there was the existence of God, and I've still yet to see anything that would convince me of that. So to me, everything is meaningless, and it's the only purpose I have here is to make my own life enjoyable.
Why don't you commit suicide?
Because that would not be enjoyable.
How do you know?
Because I've seen what it's done to other people around them that they love, and that certainly was not enjoyable for them.
How do you know that the person who committed suicide was not in so much pain that suicide was a reprieve from that pain?
That's certainly possible, but that is not the case for me.
Okay, but Albert Camus, the brilliant atheist philosopher, put it brilliantly when he said, when you begin to seriously consider the meaninglessness of life, which you've been articulating, I think, very well and very consistently, and I respect you for it, you've been consistent. When you seriously consider the meaninglessness of life, then the only question you really have to answer is, why not commit suicide? Because when you struggle with the meaninglessness of life, you begin to realize that pleasure, or your happiness, as you referred to, is ultimately meaningless. I mean, if my pleasure comes from murdering people, if I start murdering people in cold blood here, that's my definition of happiness. That's how I get my jollies, by murdering people. If I get my jollies from feeding homeless people, starving people, well, that's equally meaningless, but that's the way I get my jollies, from feeding starving people, so I do that. And when you begin to think about that long enough, you begin to realize it really doesn't matter whether I slit his throat or feed him dinner. It's all meaningless, so it really doesn't matter what I do. And when you begin to think about that long enough, you begin to realize that Camus is right when he says, you better struggle through, Why should I continue to suck wind? Why not commit suicide?
I guess if you go to the point where you slit someone's throat or you give them dinner, it doesn't matter in a sense that anything matters. But it's still, that would hurt other people, and while it's making you happy, that's why I see that as injustice, and that's why you should still be punished for it. Now, it does make you happy, and not that I recommend doing it. I mean, you can go ahead and try if that's the only thing that makes you happy, but I'm thinking that the repercussions of those actions are going to make you much less happy than you were beforehand.
Okay, but I think where you're beginning to go is, Cliff, I really don't think it's all meaningless. I think if you do go out and just murder people, that there really is something wrong there. Aren't you beginning to move in that direction?
It's meaningless in the sense that we don't have a purpose, but as a society, it is still a negative influence. And it certainly isn't desirable because it hurts our society, and thus it hurts the, I guess, the happiness of society as a whole.
All right, how do you and me giving money to support handicapped people help society? Why don't you buy into eugenics? Why shouldn't we wipe out all handicapped people because they are a drain on our limited resources?
Well, they have people that love them, and that would hurt the people that love them, and it would hurt the handicapped people as well. Hurting other people doesn't make me happy. So.
Are you ever going to spank your children?
I haven't come to that crossroads yet. I was spanked as a child, and I would say it had more positive impacts on me than negative.
Good. I think you're finding it very difficult to live a meaningless life. I think you insist upon attaching a great deal of meaning to your family life. I think you're grateful for some of the values that your parents had and held to rather strongly in loving you and disciplining you. I don't think you're just saying it's all really meaningless. The reason I say that God cannot be explained by science is because of my definition of science. Science is based on the repeatability of an experiment. If you say it is something scientifically true, and we've proven it here at this fine university, but if you can't do those same experiments in London or in New York, you don't have science. Scientific knowledge is based on the repeatability of an experiment. So God is not a physical being or a physical process that you can observe and then repeat an experiment over and over again. Not only is that true, but that's true of your family. You don't scientifically prove your family. You develop trust relationships with your family, but you don't scientifically prove people. You learn to trust them. So science is a study of process, how the organism works, and it's based on the repeatability of an experiment. But a human being is not a scientific project. In order to develop a relationship with a person, you learn to trust them and build a friendship. And then when it comes to God, God is not a scientific equation. God is a personal being who creates, but who's not a physical process that you can dissect, observe, and then repeat the experiment over and over again.
But clearly, doesn't the Bible say God's everywhere and God's force is, all around us? So if clearly, basically you're suggesting that there's a force out there which is actively manipulating our world, well, clearly that force must be somehow detectable. That's a pretty significant force. And also, you're proposing very scientific hypotheses, where the universe came from, where life came from, the origin of the earth. Like, those are all very scientific questions. You can't just say, if religion has one answer and science has another, well, which one's right? It has to be put to the scrutiny of science, does it not?
Absolutely not. All right, I'm going to work hard here and try and communicate clearly. Science is a very narrow branch of knowledge. Science is based on studying the physical process and repeating experiments over and over again to find out if there is a law of nature a scientific law that can be understood. Historical knowledge is totally different, radically different. You do not get Abraham Lincoln back on this campus every September and have him assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in order to prove that Lincoln was truly assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Instead, historical knowledge is based on not the repeatability of an event or the repeatability of an experiment. Historical knowledge is based on the trustworthiness of eyewitness testimony. Somebody saw Lincoln assassinated. They recorded it. And you study it, not in your science lab, you go over to your history department to study history. Because it's a different form of knowledge.
Right. I would agree that science can't answer philosophical questions. I'm not trying to say it would, and I can't answer historical questions. I'm not saying it would. So if you were saying that Jesus was a philosopher, if he was a man who was trying to give a way of life, then yes, science can't go one or another. I mean, that's a different branch of knowledge. But to say Jesus rose from the dead, it happened in our physical universe, thus it must have a physical explanation. And thus, it is the topic of science, and to prove something that physically happened. If I say I flew through the air, well, there must be a physical reason why that happened, and then that can be a subject of science.
Okay. The Gospels record that Jesus physically rose from the dead.
Right.
And people ate food with him. They grabbed hold of him and saw that he had flesh and bone. But they did not give us a scientific description of how physically he rose from the dead. So we do not have a scientific description of how the dead body came alive again.
Right.
Now, the question of origin, meaning by that, is there an intelligent mind behind this universe, or is there not an intelligent mind? I am convinced is not a scientific question. It is a philosophical, theological question. So you have to use reason, not a scientific process, to conclude whether God exists or not. And the philosophical, rational way I go about it is by asking myself, is it more reasonable to believe that behind order and design there's an intelligent mind, or is it more reasonable to believe that order and design comes about by chance? Is it more reasonable for me to believe that in light of the fact that the universe has a beginning, that there's an uncaused cause, or is it more reasonable to believe it just happened? Is it more reasonable to believe that the ductus arteriosus, that little flap of skin that comes down in every one of our bodies when we pass down our mother's birth canal, and switches the blood from going around the lungs to going through the lungs, that kind of amazing order and design, is it more plausible for me to believe that that happened by chance, or is it more reasonable for me to believe there's got to be a mind behind that? When I'm confronted by moral absolutes, like the slaughter of innocent children is wrong, is it more reasonable, based on my experience and observation, to believe that that's just relative morality, it's not objective, or is it more reasonable for me to believe the slaughter of innocent children is absolutely objectively wrong? If it is absolutely objectively wrong, there's got to be a mind prior to the human mind that defines what's right and what's wrong. Because if there is no mind prior to the human mind that defines right and wrong, it's obviously the human mind that defines it, and it's all relative.
I mean, I would agree that I would think I'm relatively consistent, and I would say it's all relative, in that I personally see, obviously, the slaughter of children as horribly wrong, but that is through my mind. Lions permit infanticide, and that's how it's actually evolutionarily beneficial for them to commit infanticide, and they obviously don't see it as wrong. But we, as humans, we evolved compassion, and when I see innocent people being harmed, that physically makes me feel sick, and so thus I'm going to try and do what I feel is right in my mind, and I don't think that necessarily has to come from a God. I'm just behaving how my mind was set up to behave.
What is compassion?
What is compassion?
Mm-hmm. You said it. So what did you mean when you said compassion? You said we evolved compassion.
Right.
What is compassion? What does that mean when you say we evolved compassion?
Well, I guess I would say compassion is a feeling of sympathy towards other people, people outside of yourself. I would say it would be a feeling of, I guess you feel sorry for them, you connect with them, you feel empathy towards other people besides yourself? And that is a baffling question, because most people, evolution typically talks about survival of the individual, who's the strongest, who can pass on more offspring. But for humans, we work better in groups. We're group animals, and thus to feel connection towards your brothers allows you to work together with them, allows you to not kill them, allows you to not steal from them, and thus create something better and stronger. And thus, lone animals have no problem harming others, and it's all about themselves, and that's their survival mechanism. But our survival mechanism is to work together, and that's why we do feel compassion. And so I don't see why it necessarily has to come from God.
Okay. I am convinced that I don't have to be compassionate. I am convinced I can be totally self-absorbed, totally narcissistic. I'm convinced that I could live a life of ripping as many people off to feather my nest in the suburbs.
If I were to shuffle a deck of cards, it's more than 1 in 1 trillion in a chance that I shuffle it and it ends up in the order that it ends up in. We might then say that there must be an intelligent actor that put those cards in that order. However, it's just a random shuffling of 52 cards that came up in a very improbable result. Now, obviously, there's no intelligent design behind that. Obviously, it's just a random occurrence. It's extremely unlikely, but the law of large numbers tells us that these sort of things do happen, and the fact that they happen isn't necessarily miraculous. And because it's not miraculous, we don't need to speculate about these things that don't make any kind of physical sense.
I haven't detected a question, so you
My question then is, so I'm just questioning your argument here that just because it's unlikely that we're here, there must be some kind of miracle that caused it to happen.
Oh, all I'm saying is, in my observation of reality, life comes from life. It does not come from non-life. Therefore, it's more plausible for me to believe in the beginning a living being, God, than it is for me to believe in the beginning inanimate matter produces animate life. Secondly, from all of my observation, the rational comes from the rational. The rational does not come from the non-rational or the irrational. July 1883, Charles Darwin wrote a letter to a man named Mr. Graham. In this letter, Charles Darwin writes, "In light of the fact that my brain is simply a highly developed monkey's brain, why should I trust my brain to tell me the truth about reality? Would you trust the thoughts of a monkey?" I respect Darwin. He was struggling with epistemological nihilism. Why do you trust your mind to tell you the truth about reality? The reason that I trust my mind to tell me the truth about reality is because I'm convinced that behind my mind is a rational being, a creator God. So, life comes from life, not from non-life. Reason comes from reason, not from non-reason or the irrational. Consciousness comes from consciousness, not from unconsciousness. So that is why it's more plausible for me to believe God exists than it is for me to believe there's no God. Does that make any sense?
I follow what you're saying. I think I have a number of problems along the way. The first of which is that you're saying now that God is a living being.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, does that mean that God can die?
Because God is eternal, all-powerful, self-sustaining? No, God cannot die.
All right, so then what does it mean to be alive?
What does it mean to be alive? It means to be an animate being who is able to produce, to be creative.
Okay, so death is not a necessity to be alive. You don't have to die.
No.
All right. So have you ever experienced something that was alive but never died? Have you ever experienced that?
No.
So then would you say that all living things must die because you've never experienced a living thing that has not died?
No.
All right.
I've got to be open to the possibility that there is a being who is eternal.
Okay, all right, okay, we'll go with that for a moment. All right, so then now that you're saying that even though you haven't experienced a living being that has not died, we still have to be open to that possibility. Obviously, you think that there is a living being that has not died. All right, I've never experienced life coming from non-life, but I haven't experienced everything, and I must know that it is possible for life to come from non-life. And it's not out of reason to believe that life came from non-life, especially if you're a materialist or a physicalist, and you believe that most things can be explained, or all things can be explained by natural phenomenon. It's no more of a jump in logic to say that life came from non-life than it is to say that there's a living being that cannot die. They're the same type of logic, do you understand?
A very good point, but no, I strongly disagree. My observation is life does not come from non-life.
No, I understand.
The reason does not come from irrational or the non-reason.
Okay.
Therefore, it is more plausible for me to believe that we come from a living being, that our rational minds are gifts from a rational being, than it is reasonable for me to believe that we come from non-life.
So then by that same logic, I find it more plausible to believe that if there is a God, and he is living, that he will die, and therefore he's not eternal.
That's not true.
How do you
Because
know that
when we talk about God, we're talking about a being of a radically different order than Homo sapien or an animal. Radically different. When we begin to think about the vastness of the universe, it's like looking at a beaver dam. Obviously, when you look at a beaver dam, you know that it wasn't stream bringing sticks down that made the beaver dam. But then when you go to the Golden Gate Bridge, you know, the beavers didn't make the Golden Gate Bridge. Why? Because the level of complex design is such that it requires more than a beaver's brain to put it together. It takes a human mind. Then when you go from the Golden Gate Bridge to the universe, you are taking such a quantum leap. It's incredible. And it demands a mind that is far superior to the human mind.
I don't think that that's true. Look, you're applying double standards here. The difference between your side and my side is that when I come to any kind of improbability, right, you tell me that my side is irrational and that it doesn't make sense. However, when we point out an irrationality in your side of the logic, you take this double standard and say that we're talking about something that can't be explained. We're talking about something that we can't understand. We're talking about something that is of higher order, higher rationality, however you want to word it. And then it's sort of a cop-out against the argument. What I'm saying is that there's an imparallel between what I'm saying and what you're saying, and thus I can't effectively have a point with you if you're just going to tell me that when we find a flaw in your logic, it can be explained away, but if there's a flaw in my logic because you haven't experienced it, therefore it mustn't make any sense. All I'm saying is that, look, if we analyze it in the way that you're analyzing it, and I'm applying the same kind of logic that you're applying, I'm not trying to have any kind of sleight of hand here, right? You're just saying that you've never experienced life coming from non-life. I'm saying that I've never experienced a living being that's not died, right? And if God isn't eternal, then it's obviously not the God that's been written about in the Christian Bible, for instance. Okay, so we might as well just evenly doubt the fact that life could come from non-life, just as much as we doubt that the Bible talks about the real God, if there is a God in the first place.
You can conclude that all you want. I'm saying that my experience is...
I'm saying the same thing. You understand that I'm applying the same logic that you are?
No.
In my experience, I've never seen a living being that's...
Yeah, I understand that point, but that's not the entirety of my point about God. A big part of my point about God is there has to be a mind that is so superior, not just to the beaver's mind, but to the human mind in creating a universe, that I've got to be open to a being who is so much bigger than I am. It's incredible. And that also this being could be eternal.
Because I've heard you over here for the last couple of days, and a lot of things that you base yourself upon is moral absolutism. So, in fact, I do consider myself a moral relativist. So, obviously, because I'm a moral relativist, I do not need God in my life. So, so then I just have a couple of questions that I want to direct towards you concerning moral relativism. Okay, you say morality is absolute, but my first question to you is, and one of the favorite examples that you like to use is there a time when the rape of a woman is acceptable? Well, my answer to that would be, well, not more than a couple of centuries ago, raping of a woman was considered to be spoils of war, which meant that until somebody stood up and said, hey, we should not do this anymore, raping of a woman for spoils of war was considered an acceptable practice. So my question to you is if morality is absolute, then why does it change?
Great question. When I say that there are a few moral absolutes, I am not saying that everybody follows those absolutes. obviously God has given us a free will, which means that obviously we can rationalize evil, or we can accept our society's definition that rape is okay as a spoil of war, or slavery is okay because it greases the economic wheels of our culture. But that doesn't change the fact that we have consciences that tie us into objective morals. And the only way there can be an objective moral is if there is some mind prior to the human mind that has defined what that moral is. If there's no mind prior to the human mind who defines what objective morality is, then it's obviously people who define morality, which means it's relative depending upon which person you're talking to.
Okay, then, but then you seem to talk from a perspective where you're saying, but I have reached this moral absolute. Or, I mean, my question to you is then, what keeps people, like, decades from now looking back upon this time period and saying, that person was not living out what's morally absolute? What keeps them from doing that? Because at this time period of a couple of centuries ago where that was a accepted practice, people didn't think of it as anything wrong. So obviously you don't think of some of the things that you support as wrong. So what keeps people from saying that in the future?
Okay, I am convinced that just because I don't think something's wrong does not make it wrong. In other words, I'm convinced that I don't create reality. The challenge for me is to get in touch with reality. Let's say that I think that racism is good. That doesn't make racism good, just because I think that. My thoughts can be wrong. I am convinced that all people have equal value, but all ideas do not have equal value. Some ideas are true, other ideas are false. And the idea that racism is good, I am convinced, is a false idea. Wrong idea.
Okay. But then, so then in that context, so let's bring up like a major moral issue, which is abortion, between the choice of a woman and the life of a child. Like, how do you determine which one is right based on moral absolutes?
Okay, great example. Abortion. If abortion is simply removing excess skin, I think it's hard to make a case that abortion is wrong. If abortion is murdering a child, I think the majority of us would agree that murdering children is not good. So the first thing you have to do is you have to answer the question, what is abortion? Is it simply removing excess skin? Nothing wrong with removing excess skin. Or is abortion terminating a human life motivated by inconvenience?